Hello there. So part of this video unit plan is talking about culture. So we want this to also be able to be part of a cultural video unit lesson plan. So whereas the same as you might teach cha-cha, salsa dancing, or you might teach stomp or gumboot, we want to be able to teach music in a cultural, with a cultural approach as well. So house music itself actually has a very rich cultural background, and although it's not tied to any specific um, race or countries, it still has its own culture. And it actually is native to North America, which is interesting because it didn't come to North America until the last 5 years. Again, so I'm just going to give you a quick history lesson, and I'm also going to supply some more resources under the bottom, some websites that you can check out that I went through and approved about house music history. So being a house music DJ, it's important to understand this. It's also important for children and teenagers and anybody interested in electronic music or interested in becoming a DJ. It's important to understand this, and it's just kind of interesting. So after this little music history lesson, you should be able to understand where house music came from, how it originated, more specifically the sound of house music and the different genres, and how it's developed now and how it's affected our own pop culture. So first off, house music came from disco. So disco was a huge era, as we know, in the late 60s, 70s, late 70s. And it was kind of, seen as a little bit rebellious. It was played at nightclubs where you would go and dance for 7, 8, 10 hours and just let loose. It was often found with African American culture, and sometimes it wasn't seen as being politically correct, or it was seen as kind of the outlaws of society. Nonetheless, it was very fun for the people that were involved in it. So house music was the next step from disco. So it originated with that same feeling. It, again, was mostly played with African American culture in the States. So this all started actually in Chicago and then kind of branched off into New York, which is very interesting because after that, it didn't really flourish anymore in the United States or in Canada. So as disco started fading out, house music started coming in, and there was one specific club called Warehouse in Chicago where this music was played similar to disco for 8, 10 hours, and people would go and dance and have fun and let loose. It was often in, like I said, African American culture, but also in the LGBTQ culture, which then, of course, is not as well known and not as supported now. So being African American with all of the racism going on and being gay and listening to this music was not seen as politically correct and was often frowned upon. So these cities didn't want this music around, and they really tried to push it out. So there were some famous people or godfathers of house music. For example, Frankie Knuckles. He was really the person to start house music and to DJ at Warehouse and to start his own creations of house music. And from there, it kind of turned into some different genres. So at first, we have acid house, and that was kind of the first subgenre of house music. That crept over into the UK and took storm in the UK. So it was then still seen as underground. It wasn't mainstream, but now a lot more white folk were starting to listen to this music and go to these nightclubs, so it was becoming a little bit more popular. Well, that started a huge trend in Europe, and soon enough it was all over Europe. It was in Ibiza. That's where it got a huge start as well. It's still very popular there. If you go to Ibiza, that's where they have all of the major nightclubs, day parties, and anything that's going to include house music culture. So meanwhile, it's growing and it's growing and it's growing and growing in Europe, and we have all of these subcultures. So I'm just going to take a second and play a couple for you just so you can kind of understand what the different types of house music are going. So this is all originating, again, still some in Chicago and New York, but mostly in Europe, okay? So we had a lot of kind of deep house come about, and that's obviously we just know about it more now. But I'm going to play you just a deep house song so you can kind of hear what it sounds like. So it's a more darker and deeper, just like the name. Some of them have vocals, some of them don't. It's a little more chill than some of the other types of music. So this started to develop very, very underground in parts of Europe, and is now become a major genre. Okay, next I'm going to play some tech house, which is another very popular genre now. And even within all these genres, there's many different types. Okay, so tech house is a little bit more upbeat. It often has still the same BPM between 122 to 128. Deep house is way lower usually. It's 110 to 123-ish. This could also even be considered deep house too. So a lot of the genres now blend together. They never used to be like that. Okay, so this is more upbeat. This is considered tech house. Now I'm going to show you. So this is still very underground. Something that's a little bit more mainstream now, which is electro house. So there's that more big room, clubby beat. This is what you would hear. Always has vocal breakdowns. Okay, so that's some forms of house music, and within that you can easily go onto YouTube, you can go onto iTunes and find any genre of house music. You can also go to beatport.com, which I'll put down below, and that's kind of the industry leader for finding music, and you can find any genre there, so you could, you know, show any of those to your classroom. So anyways, so we're over in Europe here. We've got house music growing like crazy. We have some producers who started producing a little bit more mainstream style music, and that's how it really got into North America. So some people like Avicii, David Guetta, Laid Back Luke, those are the ones that started collaborating with Rihanna, Nicki Minaj, Taylor Swift, trying to break into that mainstream culture. So this is why we are seeing such an uproar of electronic music and DJs, because it's now becoming quite a large career, even though the DJs have been around since the 70s and 80s. It's becoming a lot more mainstream. So DJs are starting to make as much money as a pop star would, like Beyonce or Rihanna or NSYNC or Backstreet Boys or One Direction. So that's how kind of this music that started as a very underground type movement, and a movement where people were able to be free and be themselves and just relax, it's now kind of going to that mainstream culture. But so the thing to remember is that there's mainstream and there's underground. So we still have those two differences. And mainstream is the stuff that you're going to kind of hear on the radio, hear on the TV. And underground is really the stuff you're never going to hear on the radio. You're probably not going to hear about it on TV. But you can find out lots about it on the internet. Like I said, go to Beatport, and I'll list some other resources down there. But that's kind of a quick history lesson on culture, or on house music and culture, how it originated into North American culture, why we're exposed to it now, why we weren't. And it's kind of interesting that, again, it came from that African American and gay culture, and it was seen as that type of music, so it was shunned in America, and nobody wanted to hear it, nobody wanted to be a part of it. It wasn't culturally appropriate, it wasn't politically appropriate, so that's why it went over to Europe. Eventually came back to North America. Now it's all over Canada and all over the States. So something to think about, something to talk to your students about, and again, we should now know a little bit more about house music and its culture, where it originated from, some different genres, and how it's now more common in North America.